Mr. Kapoor, are you there already? Or
he's joining.
Okay.
Good evening and welcome.
Please unmute yourself, Indila.
Sorry. Anyway, good evening and welcome to this very special webinar, Striving for Quality of Place in the Context of British Planning System, organized by Sister Nivedita University. As many of you know, Sister Nivedita University School of Architecture and Town Planning is a very young department, fairly young, but has gained a lot of momentum. And we are looking to learn from global leaders in the field. Today's session will be somewhat like that. It's such an attempt to learn from none other than a very renowned personality in the field of architecture, Mr. Colin Haylock. Thank you so much, sir, for being a part of this webinar. Give the audience a brief intro about him. Mr. Haylock is an architect planner with over 45 years experience spanning the public, private and educational sectors. He's now running a specialist consultancy focused on producing quality environments through planning and a partner in a small architectural practice working primarily in heritage and other sensitive topics, environmental topics. He led a multidisciplinary environmental design team for Newcastle upon Tyne City Council for over 10 years, during which he initiated the Europa Nostra award-winning Ranger Town project and worked extensively on major development projects across the city, from the urban extensions of Newcastle Great Park to the East Quayside redevelopment. He was the president of Laurel Town Planning Institute in 2012, and since 2000 has been involved in National Park on the design dimensions of planning and regeneration through roles in CABE, Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, continuing with similar roles with the Design Council following the abolition of the Commission in 2010. Other than that, he's into academics as well. He was a visiting professor appointed at the UCL through, he was a member of the Boris Johnson's London Mayor's Design Advisory Group, and until recently, a member of the planning committee for the Old Oak and Park Royal Mayoral Development Corporation. He's an expert advisor to Historic England and a High Street Star Spokes expert working on the regeneration of High Street across England. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Newcastle. It is a pleasure and truly an opportunity to learn from you. Thank you, Mr. Haylock. And we also have another guest today. We're very fortunate to have him here, Shri Pradeep Kapoor. He is the Secretary General of Institute of Town Planners, New Delhi. He has an experience of over 36 years, and in fact, has been the Secretary of ITP New Delhi for around 12 years now. After completing his master's from IIT Kharagpur, he went on to achieve several milestones, from being an assistant town planner to chief town planner. He is associated with several reputed institutes as their board and Senate member, and we are extremely thankful for him today as well for being with us. This will be truly an enriching session, I can see, and I would request our Vice Chancellor of Sister Nivedita University, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Dhrubajyoti Chattopadhyay, to give the welcome address. Sir?
Good evening. Good evening, Oinila. First, I should thank you for giving the introduction of our very esteemed speakers and panelists. I must, on behalf of the 3-year-old university, welcome the Colin Haylock, who is actually the past president of Royal Town Planning Institute, who is the key speaker of today, as well as our esteemed panelist, Chief Pradeep Kapoor, who is the Secretary General of Institute of Town Planners India, New Delhi. We are really very happy that our Director, School of Architecture and Planning, Professor Munish Chakraborty, for organizing this very interesting webinar, where we are going to get a chance to listen about the 40 years of surviving for quality of place through British planning system, and then the panel discussions between Sri Pradeep Kapoor and Professor Manish Chakraborty. I must thank Madam Meena Bush, our HR Industry Connect, Indrila, and all other participants who are present over here to be with us during this webinar. Just before beginning, I wanted that that this school is absolutely a new school for us. But though it's a new school, we are trying our best to establish and give the maximum exposure, because the town planning is one of the area in this eastern part of the country is not very well actually. The students has got no chance to get the exposure to that. So this architecture and town planning together in our school will definitely help. Now, I was just thinking about the birth of the town planning. Now, after the much public debate in the later half of the 19th century about this urbanization and how it should be controlled, the unplanned suburbs were springing up at an alarming rate in large cities, and the problem of how town and city environments could be made better places in which to live generated much lively new thinking. And after that, only in 1890, we found the garden city movement. And after that, we could see that the work on the chosen site at Letchworth began in 1903. And by 1914, it housed 9,000 inhabitants. And this Letchworth and Hampstead initiatives are the main inspiration behind the 1909 Housing and Town Planning Act. And the roots of this UK town and country planning system as it emerged in the immediate post-war years lay in concerns developed over the previous half century in response to industrialization and urbanization. But after the outbreak of the Second World War, we could find that a ministry was established on 7th February 1943 under William Morrison. The 1947 Act was in effect nationalized the right to develop the land. The Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 made substantial changes to the English development plan system. And from that time onwards, we could see that how the different systems are being activated. Now, the strategic environmental assessment is a requirement under the European Union laws. Planning policy guidance notes are also being gradually replaced by planning policy statements. There are minor variations, but the Localism Act 2011 introduced wide-ranging changes to the planning system in England. The bill introduced the legal provision under which local communities could develop neighborhood plans. So we are very much, we want to thank very much to our speaker today, because there is an opportunity for us to understand this 40 years of the travel of the quality of place to the British planning system. Thank you, Professor Colin. I also like that today's discussion is going to be a major interest to all the participants who are present over here. Thank you. Namaskar.
Yes, truly, this will be an enriching experience. Thank you so much, sir. Now I will request Professor Manish Chakraborty, he's the director of School of Architecture and Town Planning, and he's himself a conservation architect. And we're extremely happy to have him. You're muted. Over to you.
Thank you, Indrila. Thank you so much, our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Dhruva Chattopadhyay. We are really honored to have Colin Haylock, who is a very pioneering name in the UK, who have strove for achieving various kinds of policies, primarily in the realm of architecture and planning for the environment of cities in the UK. And UK being an island country, planning plays a very pivotal and primary role. And that has evolved and shaped into a very interesting and a very consolidated set of rules and regulations that evolved as a response to various developments and necessities that England experienced over a long period of time till now. And I think Colin would like to highlight and take us through that journey as he has experienced his own personal narrative, watching and actively working with the changing policies in the UK. Similar changes do take place in every country. India is no exception to that. And our Indian Town Planning Institute today, represented by no other than from the Indian Town Planning Institute, Mr. Pradeep Kapoor, who is also amongst us. And so we would like to see how we can learn lessons from this presentation, and where both from the good and the not so good efforts in the UK. And that will be a very learning experience and will add to the learning curve of our development in our own planning systems in India. Talking about Eastern India, yes, Dr. Chattopadhyay mentioned that we are the first university who have started this bachelor degree in planning. And we are very, very hopeful, because this has been developed out of a need and a concern that planning is very much needed looking east of India, which can actually expand to a larger Southeast Asia, because that's kind of Calcutta can be considered as a gateway to that part of the world as well. And therefore, there's a huge opportunity in planning that exists. And there are some other cities which has got the planning, but we are very happy to announce that we could also introduce this particular very felt needed course on Bachelor of Planning. And we hope that the eastern region of the country will benefit immensely from that. And finally, before I leave and request Colin to start his presentation, I would say that today the world is a global village, and I think the webinar aided by the pandemic more so actually told us that we can learn from each other by this online means, as well as when we are lifted from this situation and we get into the offline, we will already have developed our network and an understanding of each other. And we hope that this understanding will grow into meaningful research between us in India, us as in Sister Nivedita University, and in the UK, which Colin could also advise us to how to go about such collaborative research in the future. With these words, I request my good friend, a very senior good friend of mine, Colin Haylock, to start his deliberations. Over to Colin.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you for the very fulsome introductions and so on. Your colleague didn't read the last line of what I'd sent to you, which was something of my connections to India and Kolkata. I've been twice, or actually I've been 3 times, twice to meet Manish. The first time, actually, I didn't see very much because I was conceived in Kolkata, I think in the Fairlawn Hotel. I left before I was born. It took me a long time to come back, but I have a great fondness for Kolkata. And I'm still missing one of my great moments that I want, which is see England play against India in Eden Gardens. So please invite me back for one of those. Thank you. I need to share my screen if I can now. Now, just reassure me you are seeing my full screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you. I always feel relieved when that bit of technology works. Okay. I'm going to take a wide-ranging view of what has been going on in planning, and particularly the design end of planning, because my great passion as an architect planner is the quality of the places that we create. So I have always worked at the interface of architecture and planning, and I am so pleased to see that you are running a school of architecture and planning rather than separating these disciplines. I would, anything I can do to help you in terms of experience of education at the interface, I'd be very happy to engage in as we move on. He's not, right, fine. Manish assured me that the Indian planning system is similar to the English, but I thought I'd better just set out a few key points about the system, which might help you understand some of the things that we're going through. Firstly, that it's discretionary. It is led by policies that are in local plans prepared by local planning authorities, local government organisations, unless there are material considerations which indicate otherwise. So there's always a possibility of an argument for a development which doesn't directly accord with the plan. All these plans and the actions around planning are subject to government policy and guidance. Most of we have public engagement in the plan preparation process, but culturally, the vast majority of public engagement happens when a planning application is made and people can actually see what the implications of a proposal might be at the end of their street. And I mention this particularly because when I get towards the end, our beloved English government is talking about changing those arrangements now. The government is also deeply troubled by a perception that planning gets in the way of development, and is trying to speed as much small-scale development as possible by taking it out of the planning system. So I just thought I'd just mark those few key things about the system that we're working with, so that in case they were important to you in understanding the various interfaces and interactions that I talk about. But I'm gonna kick off with, well, how the hell did I get involved and interested in this? And I think it was growing up in southwest London and in Kingston on Thames. And it's a fascinating place. What fascinated me about it enormously was the river was hugely important. And I lived off to the south of here, and I used to walk into Kingston along the riverside until I got to, and I think you can probably see my cursor, till I got to this point, at which point I had to come inland because the riverside itself was simply inaccessible. In the town, absolutely fascinating series of spaces. There were 2 market spaces. This is the Apple Market, and this is the main market. And then there was a church and a churchyard. And this was a series of spaces that one worked one's way through. A little Apple Market lane here into the main market, a little alleyway here into the churchyard, round the church and into the heart of the town centre. around here. This absolutely fascinated me. It still fascinates me. And I will close my lecture with a return to Kingston because of something that I'm working on there now. I decided I wanted to study architecture. I went to Nottingham to study this. And during the time that I was there, the professor and head of school was somebody called Arthur Ling, who had worked with Abercrombie on the regeneration plan for London, prepared during the Second World War. In his practice office, he was designing the master plan for Runcorn New Town, a new town just outside of Liverpool. With a very, excuse the quality of these diagrams and so on, but they were the best that I could rob, very compelling diagrammatic approach to developing a town. It was based on a figure of 8 dedicated bus route which crossed over in the new town centre. And then the diagram was laid upon existing Runcorn and the topography around it. I was absolutely fascinated by this. Why would I not want to learn about planning and to understand how one delivered really big changes to place? I went to study in Sheffield very deliberately because that was a school which didn't deal on design. That was what I had already mastered in doing architecture. This was about politics, economics, and sociology, the course in Sheffield. I travelled from there to my first job in Newcastle. I obviously enjoy working beside rivers. I enjoy working in towns which have, and cities which have long names associated with rivers. Newcastle is the north bank of the River Tyne here, and just a simply amazing city. And I will talk a bit about various things that we've done there and use that as a vehicle for talking about changing systems of planning. Newcastle city centre is really quite staggering. It was substantially redeveloped in the 1830s in this classical style. And we're looking here towards Grey's monument at the top of Grey Street. Grey was the Prime Minister of England who introduced the Great Reform Act, who probably stopped there being revolutions in Britain because we allowed the middle class to vote in the 1830s. Made a lot of difference. It's a town above a gorge with very compelling set of bridges, very constrained topography, very interesting place to work. And it has areas of very widely varying character. Eusebourne is a former industrial area, which I'm very close to. Just bought a house which we're converting there to downsize to. But it's a place of very tight streets and mills and so on. The house that we've just bought is the one immediately on the right here. What a place to live in as a planner. And it's a place, and I started with this because when we start talking about quality of place, it's clearly every place has its own distinct characteristics. And for me, one of the important things was learning about understanding and developing a sympathy to the qualities of a particular place and working with the grain of that place and trying to enhance it rather than rubbing against it. So in this area, it's becoming gentrified. New housing is coming in, but I'm pleased to say that this is housing which actually understands the grain of the place. It's very tight streets, very tight spaces. And when we're working on guidelines for this area, we're saying the most important thing to understand about this is you have to keep streets and street spaces very tight, which means you have to look for uses that need very little car parking and don't need big service vehicles. So in some ways, the most important thing in here is choosing the right uses. And it's this association between uses and space and so on that were incredibly important to me. And my understanding of quality of place then goes from all those really big things about are we getting the right development in the right place, the right sort of character development, to do we actually, and if we work with environments, do we actually understand them? And I ask my students on heritage courses to say, what is wrong about this building? It's trying so hard to look as though it's a warehouse as part of the Oosburn. And what it clearly misunderstands? The proportion of the windows, but really importantly, the depth of the window in the elevation. You saw all those other mills, the windows were really deeply recessed. If a building had a lintel, it looked as though it was doing a job rather than a piece of artifice like this. So I put this there for a beginning, because when I talk about quality of place, I mean all of those things, from the pattern of uses through to fine detail of architectural approach. Now, working in terms of quality of place, you're constantly working with governments and their political passions and trying to understand how you can make decent places within the framework of the politics. So I'm going to touch on three things about English planning and its relationship to national politics, all of which are really problematic. The first one is for a long time, we've had Conservative governments who are passionate about home ownership. They obviously think that if people own their own homes, they're going to vote Conservative and the Conservative Party are going to be in government forever. So they've got a passion for home ownership and a real fear of under provision of housing, new housing. They say we should build 300,000 new homes every year in the UK. And this is a profile of housing that we've built over the last 100 years, year by year. The dark bit is what is built by the private sector. This is housing built for sale. And the private sector rarely builds more than 200,000 homes a year. When we've had more, it's because the public sector have built social housing. The government simply doesn't understand that the private sector will not deliver the housing it's looking for because it's not in its interest, because it erodes the profit margins of private developers. So we have a problem that a government that's committed to a path that is never actually going to deliver what it's looking for. The second, I'm sorry, this is probably in Indian terms, sacred cow of British politics is the importance of the Green Belt. It's probably the one planning policy that the general public think they understand, and it's the one which is most misunderstood by most people. This is the Green Belt around London. This is Oxford over here. You can see how almost a huge proportion of the south of England is Green Belt. This dramatically constrains the growth of London, and it means that you get a market, a housing market in London, which is desperately overheated. So it's always very difficult for people to be able to afford housing. And within that, there's some very interesting work done recently. The Wolfson Economics Prize in 2014 was won by a practice called Urbed. Ideas for building garden cities. And this was the pattern they worked in. You can see the Garden City Foundation that your Vice-Chancellor referred to. It comes here in these patterns of small settlements grouped together into a larger settlement, which in turn is connected to a major urban centre. This was an idea of the way in which you could actually produce horrible day-to-day living environments that were well connected to places which actually had those things that you needed exceptionally. Not everywhere is going to have a university, not everywhere is going to have a hospital, not everywhere is even going to have a doctor's surgery and so on. This was a way of connecting them into a system. This arrived very shortly before a general election, and the government said at that time, we won't be doing anything like this, because all of these settlements are obviously happening in Green Belt around an existing urban centre. The last one of the political foci that give me problems with the British planning system is, well, the English planning system, is that we just won't address regional disparities. They do in Scotland, which has a different planning system. And Scotland really thinks strategically about where development should happen, how various things are related to one another. I think these are really powerful diagrams. I love the fact that they're thinking outside of Scotland here, down to Newcastle. My mate, who was the Vice Chancellor at Sunderland University, another former RTPI president, said they just need to extend that arrow a wee bit further to reach Sunderland, just further down the coast. They're thinking wider, and they're thinking about connections. They're thinking about the connections between the potential for an enormous amount of zero carbon energy generation by tidal flows and wave power in the areas outside on the west coast of Scotland. But the fact that the majority of demand in Scotland is in the central lowlands belt here. So they're thinking about grid connections and so on. The English government simply won't go anywhere near there. Essentially, if they get into regional, national planning and regional planning, they have to acknowledge the fact that there are enormous regional disparities, which immediately brings the first question, so what are you going to do about them? If there is no passion to do anything about them, why ask the question? That's what's going on in English politics. Right, so having set that broad scene, I just wanted to go to the ebb and flow of government interest in quality of place as a key element in planning. I started my planning practice career in 1974. In 1980, the government produced a planning circular which effectively said design is a very subjective matter. It really has no place in planning. It really quite difficult to work at the interface in architecture and planning at that time. I'm going to touch on CABE, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, then a bit on leave it to localism, which again your Vice Chancellor referred to, neighbourhood planning, and then loop to where we are at the moment, where the government seems to have discovered beauty through a Building Better, Building Beauty Commission. And I'll finish with a sort of chaos and confusion around that. But CABE, the New Labour's government's Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. This is what it was, government advisor. This is what it did. An awful lot of work on design policy, design review, enabling research. Enabling was very fascinating. It was trying to help people be better clients when they were commissioning architects or master planners and things like this. So one of an enormous number of publications, this is one of their publications, helping clients understand what master planning was about and commission master planning wisely. They did a lot of research, they did a lot of dissemination, they did an awful lot of training. They helped every local authority have a design champion, ideally a very senior officer and a very senior member. So it was abolished in 2011 with the Conservative government having come in and not wanting to do this sort of stuff again. But you can, if you look on the web for CABE archive, you can find still accessible these wonderful publications. And very often there's been nothing produced since that is anything like the quality of what is there. And it's still a very, very valuable source. If you're really interested in this area, there's a fascinating book by Matthew Carmona and two of his colleagues at University College London, which looks at the whole business of design governance and what we can learn through that 10 years of the activities of the Commission on Architecture and Built Environment. This was the high watermark of government interest in quality of place. It produced this publication, World Class Places, had a strategy for improving quality of place and a series of objectives. Again, you can find this on the Cave Archive. These are the things that they thought were most important. I won't read them out because you can read them. You can read them faster than I can read them. And they're there in this document if you want to come back to them. One of my great friends is a guy called Rob Cowan, who produces wonderful cartoons about planning. If you can access pretty brilliant, Amazon will get you there. Plandemonium. It's a book of cartoons that he has produced about planning. They are absolutely hilarious. I hope you share an English sense of humour, and we'll get most of these, but they are great. So I did a presentation at the time when Cave was being removed, and we were moving on to a successor body, Cave, as a part of the Design Council, and where was that going? And where was that going in the world of a government that thought, actually top-down planning isn't working, so let's try bottom-up, and let's try and empower neighbourhoods to produce their own plans. So I did a quick scamper through some of the issues then, and saying how, well, the previous government seemed to get the business of design and planning. It had Planning Policy Statement 1, which had a link to a Cave publication by design. That publication set out the objectives of urban design. It set out aspects of development form. And this was a language which, because it was so widely used for probably 7 or 8 years, everybody thought this was a lasting piece of language. And it was used by developers, and it was used by architects, and it was used by planners. And as I said, even the home builders appeared to get it, because our speculative home building industry is just, well, in design terms, they're generally pretty appalling. They seemed to get it, they bought into it. There was some really valuable work on the value of good design and the cost of bad design. The publication on the right here, The Value of Urban Design, I thought was absolutely priceless. It compared pairs of environments, new developments, 6 new developments, 2 new developments in each of 6 places. So they were all these developments were delivered into the same market at the same time. But in each pair, one was driven by the principles of good design, the other one wasn't. And what this publication, done with urban economics and state surveyors, what it showed was the well-designed ones let faster and attracted higher rents. So I really love that message, you know, that good design pays for itself. That 10-year period got us some great cities, great public buildings, an increasing understanding of the language of effective design. And as I say, most people using and sharing that language. And again, another Rob Cowan cartoon. Most people using and sharing the same language. It was great. I could have conversations across the developer planner divide, and we just used the same language. We understood each other. Rob Cowan again says, but of course it wasn't always that way. Sometimes people went off on one in terms of the language. But in 2010, we got a new government with new agendas. It was looking to localism. It was looking for a reduction in policy. It was looking for a reduction in guidance, and to some extent, questioning the value of design. A rearguard action fought by people who had spent a lot of time actually, I was one of these, writing some of this guidance. I helped write the work on, it's here somewhere, the design and access statements, how to write, read and use them. We said, well, actually, out of all of that guidance, if you pick just these 7 things, you will actually protect the vast majority of the really good progress that we have made.
Can I just interject? can I just interject here?
Yeah, sure.
Is everybody able to hear Colin properly? Everybody is hearing Colin properly?
Yes, yes.
Because your voice, okay. So your voice seems to be, if you can increase the gain of your device a little more, that would be nice. Because so everybody can hear him properly, is it?
Right.
I have another headset with a headphone. Shall I convert to that?
That's okay. You can continue.
Okay, thank you. Right. Okay, I'm going to skip on through this because there's an awful lot of really useful bits in here about the value of design review in the process and the way in which we fought to protect the qualities of what we had learned through that CABE process. But we moved into a world of localism with a whole series of challenges and particularly a set of challenges about resources and professional capability in supporting locals who were trying to produce neighbourhood plans. And I'm just going to say, right, as part of that, this was the business of government learning about the difficulty of community engagement and the great difficulty in actually getting people to engage in the plan-making process rather than reacting to detailed development proposals, which I will come to at the end. Really interesting journey when one was funded, as I was funded for working for 15 days with a neighbourhood plan group that was working on a plan for Morpeth, just north of Newcastle. And I spent my time working with them, trying to help them understand the place and help them drive their plan forward. And I ran 3 workshops with them. One was on what sort of place they wanted to be and why. The second one was what did they need to do differently from what the local authority would have done. And then the third one was how would they actually do this in terms of plan policies. What was fascinating was playing back to them what they described in terms of the nature of their place, because you realised that a heritage group that spent every week going through producing a longer and longer list of buildings that they thought should be protected suddenly came to understand the place better because of the way in which we talked about it. So the importance of separation from the surrounding settlements, the importance of the fact that you could hardly see this place from the A1 major road that passed it. But when you left major roads and came into it, you didn't dribble into the place. You went round a corner, you went over a brow of a hill on a road, suddenly you were there. And the way in which circulation in the place worked, and the importance of that, and the difficulties in terms of making connections in the place, which brought us to eventually a approach to handling change and plan and development in the place, which worked best with their understanding of the place. They really struggled to get there without the professional advice. There was a question there. Shall I continue?
Yes, sure.
Sure, okay. I'm going to turn back to Newcastle because here I want to talk a bit about the work that we did in regenerating parts of the city centre. Newcastle, you saw the aerial picture. It's a fascinating city. It's got a large area of open space on the north side of the city centre. It's got a very strong northern edge with a teaching hospital, a university, 2 universities, and a civic complex, and the main retail centre in purple here. The southern part of the city centre was that Rangertown area, that classical area, which was in a pretty bad way. The city had spent ages on a policy approach which was restricting development in the northern part of the city in the hope that it would lead to development being pushed into the southern part, which would regenerate the southern part. It was an object lesson that negative policies somewhere will not necessarily produce good actions elsewhere. What we had to do was something positive in the southern part of the city centre. And this was the Grangertown project, which was a really conservation economics-led regeneration of this southern part, which I said was redeveloped in the 1830s in this classical style. There were a million square feet of vacant property, a lot of it at upper floors, some of it at street level, and in a lot of historically important buildings. You can see the sort of condition of buildings that we were dealing with here. And this is the bottom of Grey Street, the prime street in this area. And this is the conditions in one of the key properties, which is 12 Grey Street. And a sort of 10, 12-year program here resulted in really significant regeneration, to the point that this building here is now a 4-star hotel, which my elder daughter was the general manager of for several years. Nothing like leaving a legacy for your family, is there? A very important part of this was what the City Council did with the public realm. This is Grey's monument at the top of Grey Street. And this was originally a trafficked area. It had been pedestrianised, but not particularly well. This was a plinth to Grey's monument, which was actually difficult to get onto. We converted it into stepped, tiered levels thing here. It's actually possible to get disabled access onto the top level of this. So you can get in your wheelchair to here and you can thump your tub on political issues, because this is where all the political protests in the city are led from and so on. This is the absolute heart of the city. And you can see now the extent to which it is really enjoyed by people. I wanted to touch on some other really good thinking. This is again from that practice Urbed, thinking about how you deal with guiding change and development in a city centre. And again, a great document to look at their work on Nottingham city centre, based on a really deep understanding of the place and of the way in which it's viewed, way in which you view from it, establishing collections of design rules. And so this was, very often you find people using Kevin Lynch's language and talking about nodes and landmarks and so on. All too many people want every building to be a landmark and an icon and so on. It's very clearly understood that there are certain places where landmarks are important because they help you steer your way around a place. There are all sorts of other places where buildings simply need to be background buildings. And it was actually understanding the language of what makes a good background building in particular places, and then how you actually go about producing landmarks. And they did this, they sort of cast most places as background, but then said, the landmark places, we will actually have design competitions so that we get something that is really exceptional for these places. It is based on an exceptional understanding of the nature of the place that we're working with. I then wanted to touch on some other aspects of design-driven planning in practice. So this is the Old Oakham Park Royal Mayoral Development Corporation in London, which I worked on both with Boris Johnson's Mayor's Design Advisory Group and then with the Development Corporation itself. This is in West London, and it is at the point where High Speed 2, the rail line which we are currently building between London and Birmingham and Leeds and Manchester and Newcastle, not Newcastle, it's never going to get to Newcastle, Manchester and Liverpool. This is where it will junction with Crossrail, our underground system under the centre of London, which is going to open sometime. The station at the junction between these two would be the second busiest station in the UK. And around it, in this development area, 55,000 new jobs and 24,000 new homes, taking advantage of the connectivity, new connectivity of the place. So an opportunity area planning framework under the London Plan for it, some really big ideas about how you might handle movement and space through it, how density might be graded in it, based around levels of connectivity in various locations. And then looking at how you might actually start building out this place, given that it's going to be quite a few years before that station is there and that public transport connectivity is there. So looking at the places where you interface with existing areas and you start development there. So we're working on Scrubs Lane down the eastern boundary of the area. And very interesting ideas of giving the public an idea of where we were going. It was called a direction of travel document. And the principles that we were working to in terms of creating a street and how we would, what we wanted the street to do and how we would relate to it and how we would work from that street into the new development area and into the surrounding existing areas to further to the east, through to an illustration of some of the key points of intervention, clusters around these access points, down to the beginnings of some guidance as to what might happen at each of these key points. And then an exploration of how buildings might mass around there. And then testing, given that we knew roughly how much development this area was going to have to accommodate, what proportion of that overall 24,000 homes, 55,000 jobs are going to have to go here. What happened if you did them all at a certain number of stories of development? And what happened if you increased the heights at some of the key points to use these as local landmarks, marking the entry points into the major new development beyond? And because all of this was moving on, people were actually taking advantage of the Development Corporation status to begin to prepare proposals for some of the sites that were immediately available. We were actually having to deal with planning applications within that basic framework happening very early on and trying to understand whether these fulfilled the objectives, the wider objectives of the whole area. I then wanted to move on to, I said that our house builders are really pretty awful in terms of the quality of what they produce. Our essays in terms of trying to improve the quality in housing design. I've been involved in this for a long time at various stages, most recently with an organisation called the Place Alliance, which did a recent housing audit, which showed that we've learned a bit over the last 15 or 20 years, but we've still got a long way to go. This is one of the illustrations that I use to show just how far we still have to go. This is the affordable housing component in a housing scheme, which can't work out how it is going to join onto a major highway. And I say, this is the north side of these dwellings here. So you're talking about a back garden, which is constantly in shade, and between these houses and this fence, you know, please, who would want to live there? So we've tried various things. Building for Life was an initiative between Thames, the home builders, and the Civic Trust. And we've reinvented it several times over. A series of principles about integrating into neighbourhoods, creating places, elements of the relationship between streets and homes. We now morphed this through into something called Building for a Healthy Life, where we've tried to bring in the business of healthy lifestyles and so on. So even more attention to active travel and things like this. And I do reviews of developments in relation to building for healthy life criteria. This is one I was doing a couple of weeks ago in Boroughbridge in North Yorkshire. This is what the house builder produced. This is my scribbling all over it, which is sort of with ouch, and no, and what, and this is good, and so on. Yeah, trying to work out in detail whether this is actually producing a decent quality environment. We struggle to win quality through the planning system, and then because of the way in which our planning system works, quite often you get a situation, you get planning consent, and then more and more detail gets applied to what is worked on as somebody moves from that planning permission to actually building. And quite often design quality gets eroded. So the Mayor's Design Advisory Group did some work on that. And it was just, again, some really interesting closed down sessions from the Mayor's Design Advisory Group in 2016 when Boris handed on views about the way in which design quality got eroded, and a way which the old Oakham Park Royal Development Corporation used to try and protect against erosion in design quality. I'm going to close with some stuff about where we are now in our government thinking. So our government is completely rethinking the planning system. I said at the beginning that we had this system where there was public engagement in plan making process, but very few people did engage with that. Most people reacted at the end. The government's sort of trying to turn that completely on its head and almost remove the business of planning applications, saying we'll deal with it all right at the beginning of the process. So huge changes in this to the way in which we make our plans, the way in which we manage development, the way in which we get money out of development proposals to pay for public infrastructure. And it's a really terribly, terribly confused document because this Conservative government is all about deregulation, but at the same time, it wants to secure beauty. And it has a sensitivity about neighbourhood planning. And it claims things about reducing bureaucracy, but not reducing standards. So do watch this as it unfolds, because this is a nightmare scenario that is unfolding for a British planning system, which actually, in reality, hasn't changed all that much since 1947. So what we're moving to now is new local plans will divide the entire local authority area into three categories: areas for growth, areas for renewal, and areas for protection. Areas for protection are things like conservation areas, green belt areas, and so on, where planning applications will still be required. Areas for growth are ones where they would expect to have sort of strategic plans, master plans, things like this. The renewal areas are really, they're still really messy in terms of what guidance there would be there. But it's almost like you prepare codes, guides, and things like that. And basically, if your proposition coincides with those, then you have an automatic consent. So all the public engagement would be in the local plan, in the bits and pieces that support the growth, the definition of the growth area or the renewal area. There wouldn't be, for growth and renewal areas, there wouldn't effectively be planning applications. So there'd be no opportunity for the public to protest when they saw what the implications were of those propositions. A lot of stuff of making this move faster by doing it digitally, and talking wonderfully about the number of young people who are now engaging with the planning system because we're doing it digitally, and forgetting that actually you're excluding an awful lot of people who are not digitally savvy. Oops, Development management driven by all of that above, limited applications probably get a real pressure to grant consent for development and something called a fast track for beauty. So if you met certain beauty criteria, you followed a pattern book or something like that, you would get a consent very quickly. So really quite radical changes, asking an awful lot of questions about how the hell we actually do this. So the Building Better, Building Beauty Commission produced this publication, Living with Beauty. The government had produced some work on a national model design code. And in essence, if local authorities haven't produced their own local design guidance, then developers will have to resort to the National Model Design Code as the guidance that they follow. If they follow that National Model Design Code, then they get an automatic consent. I think we all know that the subtleties of place and the variety of place and so on is that no National Model Design Code is really going to get anywhere near capturing that. And if that is the path into a fast track for beauty, surely not a good idea. I'm sorry that this is a wee bit blurred, but this was the radical change in public engagement, and this fuels the government's perception of what public engagement is all about. It's all about resistance. So one person is saying, I live in a very nice area. I don't want it to be spoiled by new development. The woman is saying, I live in a quite nice area. It could do with being improved, but any change would probably be for the worse. The radical guy on the right is saying, I live in a sort of really horrible area, but no one thinks needs to be protected from the very worst development. So I'll fight it tooth and nail. The government's view was, in some ways, could quite cynically be saying, public engagement is always difficult. There's always resisting development. So let's move it out the front where it's least likely to happen. So the government seems to think that something like the American zoning systems is probably gives more certainty to the development industry. So development is more likely to happen, and we need it because we need all that new housing. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at New York City's zoning handbook. It covers 14 different ordinances, and the totality of the document runs to 1,300 pages. It's not good for public engagement. It's not good for development. It is very good for lawyers. I said I would finish by going full circle with my passion for place and the way in which we work with place. And I'm back to Kingston, and I'm back to stuff about Kingston now. My master's level teaching with University College London is very deliberately with them, because they have a wonderful group of very bright students from all around the world. And my work is on urban design, and it is all about the interface between architecture and planning and how we use planning systems to help shape and create great places. And it's quite amazing when you work with these students and they get to the business of their major research projects. And it's amazing how many of them are really looking at the way in which the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, has changed our perception of and use of places. And one of my students is working on the way in which the pandemic is relating to the changes in high streets, and in particular in our metropolitan centres. So these would be, in London, these are the metropolitan centres, places like Kingston, Croydon, Ilford, Romford, and so on, the second centres in London. If you're in Manchester, they'd be Oldham, Rochdale, and so on. These are the places which are not the major urban cores, which are accessed almost exclusively by high density public transport. These are places which are very much more mixed, are quite strong. These are the places where people who might have reluctance to use high density public transport to go to work might say, well, I can't really work at home because my home is so small. I want to work close to home, but I want to have a decent collection of support facilities. And it's looking at the way in which working close to home can actually help transform these places, because these places have suffered dreadfully with the migration of a lot of retail to online. And that was happening before the pandemic, and it's been reinforced by the pandemic. So we're looking at ways in which vacant retail floor space here can be converted to employment hubs where people can actually go to work close to home and have all those sorts of support facilities. We're looking at what the car parking is used for. If it's not used to support retail, can it be converted to other uses? Or is it needed to support working close to home? I find it absolutely fascinating that, well, 50 years after I left Kingston on Thames, I'm coming back to working on Kingston on Thames to think about how it has changed, how it has changed in those 50 years, how it will change in the future, and how alongside those changes, the endearing qualities that I talked about in terms of the Apple market, the main market and things like this, how these just keep getting more and more new, attractive lives. That's it. Thank you. I will stop my screen sharing now.
Thank you very much. You did rather well with the time, I must say. Yeah. I really, if I may kind of give my initial remark about the presentation and try to relate to the context of India, some of which can be on a broader level, perhaps has got similarities, particularly the fast track grant of permission for development, which is now perhaps England is embracing as a part of the planning policy. My initial observation is, to your overall presentation, is that by and large, over a long period of time, the planning system encouraged local level plan preparation, development planning, participatory planning with the community. So your presentation essentially highlighted how that perhaps changed over a period of time, how that became more and more away from the government's responsibility towards more private participation, as in the retail development that you mentioned at the end. And that is a scenario perhaps is also happening in India, in many parts of India, where the critical amount of money necessary in the context of India, which is huge, to address all the requirement by the government. So there has been an increasingly greater and greater participation of the private, which is encouraged by the policy programs of the government, and as an option to meet the present demand, where your constant emphasis on design qualities and design guidelines plays a very important role, and how CABE came into the picture even when the design quality was on the downward trend, even in England, which we always admire from India, that it's something very innovative. And that is perhaps a very compelling task of how government increasingly become perhaps a very fashionable word called enabler, which actually enables a lot of impatient development, a quick profit motivated development. And that perhaps I could sense a similarity in your presentation in the context of today in the British planning system. And perhaps in a developing situation like India. I read this in this overall very broad brushed understanding. Of course, you mentioned about various details that goes into the making and achieving the quality of space, but how you ensure the quality of space in this onslaught of private sector development, which is rather impatient to go from one development to the other as quickly as possible. And how do you address that in your so I request our secretary, former Secretary General, Indian Town Planning Institute, of how Mr. Kapoor, Mr. Kapoor, read this in this way in order to connect it between Indian context and the present UK context of planning. If I may say so, Colin. You have to unmute yourself, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Manish. On behalf of Institute of Town Planners India, I welcome Professor Haylock in this webinar. At the outset, a nice presentation, very elaborate and eye-opener for us, because what I feel, the more or less the planning system, the British planning system is more or less same what we adopt in India. In India, the urban planning is the state subject. It's not handled by federal government. But still, many policies have been formulated by Government of India and being funded by them, which are to be implemented by the respective state governments. At the beginning, I would like to brief that what the planning system exists in India. The hierarchy of plans, if we see in India, though it varies from state to state, depending on their legislation and regulations. But overall, a picture can be depicted. The first category of plan, which is formulated for any notified urban area, it can be a metropolitan area or a municipal area, or below that, a town panchayat. Till recent past, the urban development was not a priority sector, neither at the federal government level or with the state government. As very rightly said by the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Chattopadhyay, that not only in Eastern India, but across the country, this was never a private priority sector for the state governments. Again, coming back to the planning system, there is a master development plan prepared for any notified urban area, which is basically nothing but a land use planning. A generalized land use planning is done based on the projections for horizon year, which is generally a 20 years time. Then second category of plan is the zonal development plan. Somewhere in some state, it's called sector plans. In some state, it is called zonal development plans. And third in the hierarchy of plans is the town planning schemes, which has the maximum details of that particular area for which a scheme is formulated. In the year 1993, the federal government brought a 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. What it says, under the 12th schedule of the Act, the urban planning was delegated to the third tier of the government, which is the municipal bodies, the local bodies. But they were not prepared to handle it. Even today, there is no political system, or there's no awareness about the master planning at the local level. Still, in most of the states, the master plans for urban areas are prepared by the town planning department of the state governments. And in the name of public participation, the local elected councillors, they are invited when the draft is prepared for their views on that. And unfortunately, they are not mature enough to understand the master plans. So again, the state government approves the plans and passes on to the local authorities for implementation. And you can imagine that when one doesn't have feeling of belongingness, or they don't own that master plan, how we can think of the implementation will be done by them in the right spirit. Anyway, now the situation is slightly different over a period. I would like to say that in the last 10, 15 years, the priority has been, are being given to the urban development sector. Federal government, they create various policies, and in last 5 years, many policies have been formulated by Government of India, like Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, to cater to the need of urban poor, housing needs of urban poor. Then there is a smart city mission, which has identified 100 cities for world-class infrastructure development in those cities. 500 cities have been identified under infrastructure development as Amrut towns, Atal Mission for rejuvenation of urban areas. Then there is Swachh Bharat Mission, clean cities, lots of funds have been flowing through that. Another important sector of urban development is urban transportation. And in India, very few cities have efficient urban transportation system. Now, with the support of Government of India, I think 10, 15 years back, we heard only in Kolkata, the metro. Now, more than 15 cities have metro rail as a public transport system in urban areas. Next, recently added component in urban areas is tap water connection. And Government of India has opened up a new ministry as Jal Shakti Mantralaya, and funds are being flown for urban area as well as rural area to provide tap water for every household by 2024. These are some of the schemes, and as far as the budgetary provision is concerned by Government of India, besides the state government, for 21-22, 54.5 thousand crores have been earmarked for urban sector, which is 14% higher than the actual expenditure of urban sector in 2019-20. So now the priority has been extended to urban sector by not only by federal government but by the state governments, because in all these missions which has been created by Government of India, the state governments and local bodies are also supposed to contribute the matching grants. So this is all about the planning and the financing of urban development. But I would like to share with you that there is a gap between planning and plan implementation, because there is a lack of political will for implementation of master plan with the objective these are prepared. Then the biggest impediment in implementation is the availability of land. The land acquisition, because in India, the land holding is in private hands, and land acquisition for urban infrastructure is a very tedious job. And with the new act which came into being, it becomes further difficult to acquire land in urban areas. Some of the states have enacted the Land Pooling Act, in which the land of various landholders is assembled for the purpose of implementation of town planning schemes. And they surrender their land to the local authority, and after the development, the public areas, which are the land which has been earmarked for public facilities, they have been taken over by the local bodies, and the developed land is redistributed to landowners after deducting their contribution for the infrastructure or the public utilities in that area. This is one successful scheme which is being implemented in various states. Then another impediment about the implementation of master plans or town planning schemes is the role of the local authorities is very minimal at the time of preparation of plans. We take them on board when the draft plan is prepared, and we ask them to give their views on the draft plans before the finalization or notification of the plans. So we are in the process of creating our awareness at the lowest level of political system in India. And once I hope that the local political system is aware about the master planning, probably it will help in the implementation of plans in the way they have been created. So this is all I wanted to share with you, and thank you, Dr. Manish, for giving me this opportunity. And now we are open for discussion. Any questions or any clarifications, you are free to please raise any issue. You are mute, Dr. Manish.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. I think that was quite, in a very short period, you have actually kind of encased, which Colin is aware, but I think he's hearing it from no other than Mr. Kapoor. You know, coming back to the presentation, we have amongst us today Professor Ranjan Chattopadhyay, who was the former Director General of Kolkata Municipal Development Authority. And we have another a person who is also a very dear friend and works in Penang, called Gwyn Jenkins. While there are many others, Rajut Rai, who teaches Bachelor of Planning in SPA, taught for 6 years and now heads another department. They have some questions. I will leave to them, but to begin and to kind of refocus our presentation by Colin. Colin, your reactions to the thought that England had no other option but to abandon its state-sponsored planning and move towards a more participatory, development-oriented planning, particularly with the bigger cities.
Right. Thank you, Pradeep. I find myself always sort of embarrassed by, if you like, the limited understanding that I will inevitably have of the Indian context. And so I'm always anxious about the extent to which one can draw direct comparisons, even if in pure administrative terms we operate similar systems. You know, if the legal framework is similar, its interpretation will inevitably be different. I'm acutely mindful of a strange contact I had on my first trip to India. I was reading a book about it was some guidance to help somebody who was actually going to live in India for a while about how to engage with India. And a woman sitting next to me looked at this and said various things. I'll tell you what it's really about. And she told me other things. And she asked me what I was doing. And she said, my brother is very senior in the ministry in India. You need to send him one page, because he's a very busy man, one page on what he should do with the Indian planning system. When I got back, I sent just a 2 or 3 line thing saying, I wouldn't dream of advising you. I don't understand it well enough. And the worst thing that you can do is import wholeheartedly Western guidance because your context is different and you need your own, you need your own appropriate responses. So I was always embarrassed about the extent to which things were transferable when I was talking about stuff here. But there are a few things that occur to me. Firstly, in your school, your headline is a School of Architecture and Planning. And I very desperately hope that you are actually in that helping educate architects who understand planning better, and through that maybe actually producing buildings for their clients that come with a better understanding of the place in which they're working. And I hope also that you're producing planners who can better help work with architects and developers who may not have the understanding that your students are bringing to the equation, to help them understand better how to work at the interface with the place. And more important than everything that I've said is this business of the acute understanding of place and how to work with it. One of the constant factors in here is that in the middle of all this, there's a sort of, if you like, one way or another, there's some political legitimacy that's given to things through a planning consent or a license or whatever it is that you use to do this. And we also struggle with politicians who don't understand planning enough. One of the big things that CABE tried to do was to actually produce more and more material and work more and more people who would work with councillors to help them understand the planning challenges of the places that they were administering. There are interesting models. Actually, one interesting thing in Britain recently was that in Northern Ireland, when the peace agreements really began to bite in and government was working reasonably well, it's fallen over subsequently, but we moved control of planning from being a government organisation to a local authority organisation. And we had to do an enormous amount of work to help the local authorities skill themselves to deal with this. So the RTPI helped in that process quite considerably. It ran an organisation called Politicians in Planning Association, which allowed politicians who sort of understood that they had significant planning responsibilities but wanted to understand them more, help them network with each other. CABE tried with the Design Champions Network, and the important thing in that was trying to find a senior local government officer who would also work with a senior local politician, and that together they would work on how they could work with the best interests of their place in planning terms at the interface between the executive in the officers and the politicians in terms of having to make the difficult political decisions, or persuade their fellow politicians that something was a wise thing to do. So, I mean, there are all sorts of interesting models, some of which might be helpful. In major metropolitan areas, I don't know how your metropolitan government works, but London is a great example where there are 32 boroughs plus the City of London and then the Greater London Authority. They all come together in a learning network called Urban Design London. They all put a little bit of money in and they all get a lot of learning out. So, there may be some models that would help in this struggle of politicians actually understanding and feeling comfortable with the importance of planning to them and how to deal with the interface between what the public sector can reasonably control and finance and how to help use private finance wisely.
Right.
So
Right.
one hell of a challenge, though.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see.
But in between, in India, we have one more, hierarchy between planner and politicians. That is bureaucracy. So that is another challenge. That is another challenge. First to convince the bureaucrats, then convince the politicians.
I've just recently read a book by Thakur, what the British did to India. Yeah, it was what we really did to India. And one of the things was obviously we blessed you with bureaucracy.
Yeah. I think yeah, that was. But what I think, Mr. Kapoor, you would perhaps like to know your views on the need for this design input more into planning system, which Colin also mentioned, is perhaps, do you see that there has been an erosion in that while conceiving many plans, more design-oriented consultations? That is, maybe in Delhi, there is a Delhi Urban Arts Commission to look into the Delhi aspects of quality of design. But in the rest of the country, can Town Planning Institute or Institute of Town Planners has a role to play in this, perhaps? I don't know. I mean, your views on that, Mr. Kapoor.
Yeah, you're right to some extent. But, in India, the urban design is the second stage of the planning, urban planning. So you are very right that except for Delhi, there's no other state which takes care of urban design once the master plan or development plan is prepared. At the time of the implementation of that plan, the urban design part comes into the picture.
Yeah.
Which is not there so far. And this being the state subject, I think with the Delhi experience, most of the state governments rather, again, the bureaucrats or politicians, they think that if we create this kind of body, there will be another hurdle in implementation process of the master.
Right.
That is the general, mentality in the state governments.
Right. Right. We would Ranjan Chattopadhyay would like to highlight a few more points. Ranjan, are you there?
Yeah.
Ranjan, can we hear something more on this line of the presentation from you? Because he kind of headed the Department of Planning in the Kolkata Municipal Development Authority. It's a very important, and I had the opportunity of teaching with him. So Ranjan, I would like to hear your.
Yes, I was Director General of Kolkata Metropolitan Development Authority, KMDA. So I am just participant in this program. Kapoor is a very good friend of mine, and we are working a long time, both in different areas, in organizational areas. We have worked together, and I know Kapoor is very much aware of the Rajasthan situation, not only Rajasthan situation, all over the country. A lot of information is moving in every states, and he has received a lot of information regarding the town planning plan preparations and implementation procedure also, and different problems also in different areas. But my working area is mainly on Kolkata metropolitan area initially, initially means long 34, 40 years, where I faced that in Kolkata, in West Bengal, in any rule, it's not mentioned that government or any authority, they have to prepare the master plan. It's only mentioned under Town Planning Act that they have to prepare land use and development control plan, and that is basically with some zonal control regulation. Nothing else is there, and they have designated power. They have handed over the power of implementation to the local authority, and actually nobody bothers about this plan. KMD prepared this plan and hand over to other authorities. So no development is controlled by this plan. That's the real situation here in West Bengal. And but
Right.
in participatory planning, what Kapoor mentioned, the local authority, they have not mentioned in one plan that in Bengal Municipal Act, it's mentioned that they all local authorities, they have to prepare the basic development plan, not basic, sorry, draft development plan, DDP. And in KUSP program, Kolkata Urban Services for the Poor program with GFID, if all municipality, they have prepared with the participatory process their development plan. But after preparation of that development plan also, that is not implemented properly. That's the most thing, that reality, what Kapoor is already mentioned, they have not realized that that plan has to be made. But my experience is little different. I am working now with master plans of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh also. 7 towns of Andhra Pradesh and 4 towns of Odisha also. But in Andhra Pradesh, my experience is different. Even a small municipality, when we are discussing in local level about the master plan, they are mentioning that this thing is not implemented in earlier master plan also. So they are a little bit aware, and their local municipal corporation in one town planning office is there. One planning officer is also there. So the situation is little different in Andhra Pradesh, and I think Odisha also. Andhra Pradesh is much better, I think, in that aspect. So situation is, what Kapoor is mentioned is almost, implementation procedure is almost same in everywhere, and West Bengal is, I think, it's no implementation in master plan or plans, only development schemes they are preparing and they are implementing that. So we have to improve this situation, what Kapoor is mentioning, and we have to concentrate on implementation factor also. And now we are working in the local area plan also, and local area plan can be implemented, and the urban design aspect can be considered in the local area plan, what I believe that can be implemented in local area. That's all my observation in this.
Right, right. We have a little, yes, Mr. Kapoor.
Ranjan, you very rightly said, recently I was also in Andhra Pradesh.
Yes.
Probably the way they are moving ahead, they have appointed one planner in every municipality to create awareness among the politicians, among the common man about the urban planning.
Yes,
and they are helping out the local bodies for preparation of plan and how to address the issues of local common man. So that model, I think it should work, and once it works, probably other states can also follow.
Yeah,
Because
I remember.
I like to add one line.
Yes,
I like to add one line with this. And another important thing, the local level planning office in Andhra Pradesh, that we have received a lot of planning data from also, which is very difficult to receive from the other areas.
Yes.
So local planning is keeping all the planning data required for the master plan and plan preparation. We are getting easily from there also.
Yeah, there is no denying that, the size of India and the scale of India is so huge. A comparison to the size and scale in the UK perhaps is not comparing orange versus orange, right? In terms of planning system. But this thought just came to my mind right now, that do you think, Colin, that the whole movement of conservation of buildings and places, which has gained momentum in India over the last 1 decade or so, is a bit like your initiative way back in 1990s in Granger, in Bradford, and history loves repetition, maybe in that regard.
Before Colin says his words, sorry, Manish, I forgot to mention that in 2015, Government of India started another mission for heritage conservation named as Hriday. And
Yes,
and
the
in
Hriday
each-
and yes.
yeah, in each state they have identified few
Yeah.
cities
Yeah.
for heritage conservation
Yeah.
and restoration.
Yeah, but what happens, Mr. Kapoor, in India, once again, the scale comes into the picture.
Right.
And once again, the implementation becomes a big issue. And yeah, because I think the replication of small scale initiative, which has been shown by the conservation movement in India in different parts, is perhaps a better model to look into and to replicate.
Yes.
That has been, so I would like to hear Colin's reaction to that, vis-a-vis what he mentioned about this Boris Johnson's recent initiative of beauty movement, if I may say, subsequently.
Right. Well, two rather different questions there, Manish.
Yes. Yes.
So the first one, I think there's a bit of human nature that sort of loves a lasting association with a place, loves to be able to feel a rooted connection to place that goes with buildings and spaces and so on that are familiar. There's an enormous reaction to loss of cherished environments. And it's in some ways, it's probably a good place to start from in terms of public interest in the nature of urban change, because it's the one that sort of gathers people together. So it's fascinating working with Centre in Newcastle, where we did some work where we asked people, we asked businesses what were the things that were most important to them about their property and about the places around them, and what was most important to them in various dimensions and so on. And you've got these wonderful contradictions where what I really like is being part of such a distinctive environment in central Newcastle. What is the problem? Living and working and living with, working with, and having to adapt a listed building. So they liked the collective, but they didn't like the implications on it for themselves. But to some extent, by staying in there, they obviously bought into, they obviously valued the collective more than the individual, because otherwise they would have just withdrawn. But then they also said, what worries me most is traffic congestion. What do I most need? More parking. So we have. I think we have just by nature we're a very contradictory race, and one of the awful things that planners have to do is try and resolve some of those contradictions. Right, Boris's. Well, so okay. So I think that heritage-led conservation, I think, will always have quite a substantial supportive audience. You might have to drag along some less willing developers and so on. But Boris's stuff on building better, building beauty, fast track for beauty and so on. Is Manish, you need to.
Sorry, I missed your last point.
Yeah, I said you needed to mute.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Right, okay, Boris's stuff is full of contradictions. and it's also driven by a particular view of beauty. And it tends to be a very traditional and very comfortable view of beauty. It's intriguing when you look at material that goes with their ideas of pattern books and so on. None of it involves recent development. It is basically people are happiest with historic development rather than contemporary development. And there was I'm doing some work at the moment in support of a local pilot on design coding, which our ministry is trying in 14 different authorities around Britain. And when I read it and so on, it says, you know, sort of things that might come through in there is traditional materials, so the use of red brick in the Midlands and warm stone in the Cotswolds, and you're thinking, actually, life's infinitely more complex than that. And when I look at the references that are talked about in terms of pattern books, is one of the things. Like if you adopted a pattern book, so you actually follow that. Well, my street here in Newcastle it came out of a pattern book. It was a late Victorian pattern book. And fine, if you want to produce more late Victorian housing, you have a pattern book. But I'm not sure where the pattern books lie for contemporary development. So we're just going down the line of just producing more fake traditional places. Right. That would get, if you went down that line, you'd quickly get a consent. So it's actually something that Prince Charles was sort of very fond of. If you come across his work in Poundbury, in Dorset, that sort of work, that's the sort of work that will sail through the new planning system.
Yes. Yeah, that was the question that somebody asked, what does Prince Charles has to say about the beauty movement?
He thinks it's wonderful. He thinks it's absolutely wonderful. One of the challenges that we had when we were working in Old Oakham Park Royal Development Corporation, the Greater London plan had what is called a density matrix. So it was appropriate densities for different parts of the city, dependent on public transport accessibility and broad context. And so you had to follow that density matrix. You could only go above it if the scheme was mitigated, if the issues were mitigated by good design. Right. Now, nowhere in the plan was there a written in blood definition of what good design was. So constantly we were having to say in Old Oakham Park Royal, this is outside the density matrix. It's producing more development. It's needed to make the site work viably. It's needed to work to produce enough affordable housing. So is it well designed enough? Is it meet that threshold of mitigated by good design? And that was what they had experts like me there for, saying yes, it was. Yes. Or no, it wasn't.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm afraid we've gone into some very difficult territory.
I know this is difficult to grasp, this whole idea of planning system, but you did it marvelously well. I think at least it kind of sparked these questions in the minds of the people. And that's fantastic. I would like to say thank you so much to you for agreeing to come and talk to us and share your views on the British planning system. And I only tried to link it up with the efforts of planning in India and no two places are identical. So no two places planning policies can be identical. But there is lessons learned. Lessons can be learned. Like historians are very useful for any politicians. There's always a post called state historians, right? State historians are very important for the present government as well. And therefore, I think these lessons of yours over a period of 40 years perhaps hold some lessons for micro planning, which adds up to macro planning. And I think that is a sensibility that we perhaps will grow. We will definitely try to inculcate the design aspects in our curriculum of planning, which is, I think, very important because our local level implementation arm is very weak in terms of design understanding, where implementation kind of rests on design. And therefore,
you're not on your own on that, Manish. It's weak in the British system as well.
It's weak. But I would like to end with this hope that one of the biggest or two biggest town planning institute in the world, if you want to add American Planning Association, APA, I think there is a lot of synergy that can be built in the coming years. And with these thoughts, both at the planning level, administrative level, as well as at the education level, which I hope there will be research relations, collaborations, there will be policy collaborations, which Indian Town Planning Institute will perhaps take it up one by one in the coming days and years. But we hope to see you in Calcutta and in India. And
for that match at Eden Gardens.
Yes, at the Eden Gardens. And we also would like to explore how research interest of mutual interest can be explored, so that we can actually build that consciousness that is the basis of perhaps addressing the implementation of our plans, which are always set in a very good objective, but like in all other countries, perhaps doesn't get or doesn't reach to the desired objective because of lack of certain things, lack of some of which we identified today very succinctly by some of the participants. Thank you very much, Mr. Kapoor, and thank you very much, Colin, and all the participants. Thank you very much. I request Ina Bose to thank everyone and put the presentation to an end.
Thank you, Manish.
Before you say the final words, Colin, you can think of coming to Rajasthan also, where planning is a tradition for last 300 years.
Yes.
Thank you, Manish. It was a very enriching, very learning session. Thank you, Mr. Haylock. Colin has done a wonderful presentation. And the other speakers who spoke, thanks Manish for calling them, it actually landed up into a panel discussion finally. And it was really very good, really very good.
Can I just ask Mr. Kapoor, does Rajasthan include Jaipur?
Yes. Yeah, Jaipur is capital of Rajasthan.
Yeah, because one of the people that I teach most with at the University College London is a woman from Rajasthan, from Jaipur.
Okay.
And I have spent time in Jaipur. I know it's an amazing, amazing city.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pink City. Pink City we call.
Thank you.
We have with us Inadi Guin from Malaysia in Penang, which is a fantastic, interesting city with a lot of contradictions of heritage and development, like in many places in India. And it's a World Heritage City. And Guin has been tirelessly working there for years together. So I'm very happy, Gwyn, that you could make it to today's presentation. And we would like to hear a presentation from you in the coming days, if you agree.
Well, I'd love to. And thank you so much. This has been an absolutely wonderful way of spending my evening, actually. I've learned so much. I was actually, Colin, you took me back because I studied in Kingston upon Thames, and I am from Nottingham. And also I did it when we were at Kingston upon Thames studying three-dimensional design. We did a town study in a little place called Blythe, which is next to Morpeth. So all of your very, very interesting dialogue. And then this wonderful panel discussion afterwards, which was really very valuable to hear. Thank you so much, all of you. It's been a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jenkins. Thank you.
Thank you.
Manish, should we call it a day?
Yes, you have to say that.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Colin, once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody who could make it.